It came down the net as a sentence without adjectives. VT authorized for ground. No trumpet, no red ink header, just a routine-looking directive that, in the frozen Ardennes of December 1944, would turn ordinary shells into a physics lesson with teeth. Battery commanders huddled over field telephones and grease pencil boards in canvas tents that breathed frost. Fire Direction Center, FDC clerks, fingers numb in wool gloves, copied the line twice to make sure it was not a rumor. Section chiefs glanced at the ammo stacks, olive-drab crates stenciled with lot numbers and cryptic codes, and knew immediately what the sentence meant. The box everyone had been guarding like contraband, the one with the extra paperwork and the whispered brief, was no longer a museum piece. It could go to the gun line. Until that moment, proximity fuses, VT for variable time, were a closely rationed miracle. Everyone had heard how the Navy loved them. Gunners on destroyers swore by fuses that turned AHOA into a radar net of metal, bursting at the exact moment a plane's skin tickled a Doppler threshold. But on land, for nearly 2 years, the rule had been absolute. No VT against ground targets. If a dude fell into enemy hands, German engineers might decode the secret and blunt the edge. The U.S. could not afford to refight radar in miniature. December changed the math. In the Bulge, German armored thrusts were knifing through woods and villages. Snow ate blast. Trees turned impact fuses into lumberjack tools. Infantry bled for yards. A weapon that could outsmart treelines and snowpack was no longer a luxury. It was a duty. The technology sounded like magic and behaved like engineering. Inside the stubby metal head, where a simple point-detonating striker had lived, now sat a miniature radio set. Oscillator, amplifier, battery, and a tiny brain that listened for its own echo. As the shell screamed through air, the fuse transmitted a radio frequency forward. When the returning waves, Doppler shifted by closing speed and geometry with the ground or a target, crossed a designed threshold, the fuse tripped the detonator. Not on contact, not on a timer guessed from weather tables and the gunner's faith. At a height. The right height. Up where fragments could travel sideways into men and machines instead of digging themselves harmlessly into snow. In those first hours, the order traveled faster than trucks. Corps artillery phoned divisions, divisions phoned regiments, and regiments walked VT fuses down to battery ammo dumps under blankets and tarps. The brief to gun crews was equal parts awe and caution. This fuse is armed by spin and a flight gate. Do not handle like a football. You will not set time with a key. The fuse sets itself. You will record bursts and heights in the log. You will not miss. The cold swallowed laughter before it could form. Chiefs nodded. If a fuse could read distance without a lieutenant's stopwatch, they would give it good data to read. Bore sight verified, quadrant elevation exact, powder temperature checked, base plates spiked deep. The first mission came on a road no map bothered to name, where a German company assembled in the visual comfort of a tree line. In the past, the American answer would have been quick time fuse airburst if a battery had time to cut and crimp fuses precisely. Otherwise, impact shells thudding into frozen ground, throwing up serious-looking dirt fountains that looked deadly, and were not. VT made the old choice feel medieval. FDC took a spotter's grid, wind, powder lot, tube wear, and meteor data, spat out the firing solution, and added only a single new syllable on the command line. VT. Gunners seated rounds, vented frost from their lungs, and waited for fire. The battery spoke. The tree line answered with a sparkle of bursts at a height that looked wrong to anyone used to mud. 20, 30 feet up, maybe more. A beat later, the sound arrived. And then the human sound. The forward observer's voice, clipped as a surgeon's. "Rounds on. Repeat." On that day, and a dozen like it, German veterans would later say the shells had eyes. That was superstition's way of parsing Doppler. What the fuse had was an ear tuned to the math of closure. What U.S. artillery had, suddenly, was a way to hang steel in the air where men exist. Chest high, above foxholes, inside the canopy of trees whose trunks had shrugged off impact bursts for 3 winters. In the Bulge, where surprise traveled in columns and counterattacks formed in woods, the difference between exploding in the dirt and exploding in air was not a statistic. It was survival. By nightfall, the directive's tone had become the battery's tone, unexcited, relentless. VT authorized for ground was no longer a novelty. It was a new normal. Ammo NCOs wrote new chalk marks on crates. FDCs added a column to their logs for observed burst height. Liaison officers rewired their imagination. Assembly areas that had always been artillery-resistant under trees were now invitations. Somewhere well behind the line, an ordnance officer smoked in the lee of a truck and let himself smile exactly once. The physics had arrived. The Ardennes would not be the same. The fuse did not think like a man. It thought like a metronome with a tape measure. Inside a cylinder no longer than a handspan, engineers had crammed a vacuum tube oscillator, a simple amplifier, a rectifier, a tiny reserve battery activated by setback, and a thyrotron that served as a switch. Spin from rifling armed the fuse. Acceleration woke its battery. As the shell flew, the oscillator broadcast a steady radio tone forward along its axis. The world answered by reflecting that tone back. The distance to that world, ground, treetop, vehicle skin, pressed the tone higher or lower by Doppler shift. The amplifier grew the echo. The circuit mixed outgoing and incoming signals. The beat between them, the frequency of difference, slowed as the shell approached a surface. When the beat fell through the designed gate, the thyrotron tripped. The detonator fired the booster, and the main charge broke the shell into mathematics. A point-detonating fuse offers certainty you can see. Hit the ground, explode. A time fuse offers certainty you hope for. Crank to a setting, trust the tables, bless the wind. A proximity fuse offers a third certainty. When distance equals hurt, detonate there. In snow and timber, where blast on impact wastes itself and time fuses punish small errors with theatrical misses, proximity is a cheat that feels like stolen time. Burst height is no longer a compromise. It becomes a design feature. The fuse's threshold is chosen during test so that, for a gun's typical trajectories, an airburst happens roughly in the envelope where fragments will saturate a human volume. Engineers had argued about everything. Would propellant gases ionize the air and blind the fuse at muzzle exit? Not with proper gating. Would snow and ice reflect poorly? They reflect just enough. Trees reflect just right. Would a march through rain make fuses moody? Seal them correctly. Pack with care. Would the fuse trigger on heavy flak smoke or chaff? Sometimes. Learn and adjust. The lab answers traveled with the crates, written in ordnance sheets and whispered by liaison officers. Trust the gate, trust the Doppler. Don't outsmart the fuse, feed it good gunnery. Burst height was the gospel. In open ground, A burst at 20 to 30 feet above surface throws a lateral storm, whose fragment density at chest height is a horror story written in steel per square meter. In woods, a burst above the under canopy keeps fragments from burying in soft earth and multiplies ricochet paths among trunks. If an old impact pattern made holes in snowbanks, an airburst pattern wrote a black lace across a platoon. Casualty curves that had been modest at range under impact suddenly kinked upward. An FO who once had to correct 2, 3, 4 salvos to walk fire into an assembly could now call one volley and say, "Repeat," only out of habit. The fuse did have limits. It did not love grazing fire. Flat trajectories could push the Doppler gate awkwardly. It did not perform miracles when the target lay under thick, wet conifer canopy that trapped fragments. It did not appreciate voltage sag in the cold if storage protocols were ignored. Gunners learned to warm fuses inside their coats on the worst days and to keep lot numbers married to weather in the log. Fire direction officers learned to pair VT with the right shell. High explosive as the baseline, variable charge to shape the range, super quick or delay only when the ground demanded old tricks. Above all, VT loved a stable solution. The closer a battery lived to its calibration, bore sight fresh, tube wear known, quadrant elevation honest, the more the fuse could do the work it was born to do. In the Ardennes, that meant old-school craft. Plumb bobs on trails, reading bubbles with eyebrows, recording powder temperature like a miser counts coins, checking the copper crusher data on lot cards, and not lying to yourself about a bent sight mount you promised to shim tomorrow. Proximity punished sloppy gun lines because airburst lethality magnifies errors. A burst 20 yards ahead of the column is a sermon. A burst 20 yards behind is a snow painting. The promise of VT was not that it made artillery smarter than men. It was that it made artillery smarter than terrain. Snow no longer absorbed your fury. Trees no longer forgave your guess. Distance no longer turned your seconds of human reaction into yards of harmless miss. In a battle where roads, villages, and woods wrote the script, a fuse that listened to distance rewrote the stage directions. The lumber of war, map boards, protractors, plotting pins, did not change when VT marched into the FDC. What changed was the meaning of a line. Before VT, a line down a road meant hide blast in ditches and pray time fuse cuts are good. After VT, the line meant hang steel over their hats. The FDC still drove the same train of math: convert FO's polar or shift data into grid, interpolate met data, choose charge, compute deflection and quadrant elevation for each tube, adjust for wear, order the mission. But now the choice of fuse simplified the orchestra. On many targets where time fuses once demanded a minute of knife work, setting rings, double-checking keys, trusting fingers, VT made the discussion disgustingly short. Fuse, VT, shell, charge, green bag 3, battery, fire. Time on target, TOT, was where the new fuse courted an old masterpiece. The TOT idea is obscenely simple. Calculate each battery's time of flight to the target, add the human and machine delays back at the gun line, and order fires so that every shell arrives in the same second. Surprise is weaponized geometry. With proximity fuses, TOT became a blade with a polished edge. Instead of the first salvo thumping into dirt and warning the enemy that artillery had chosen this map square for a symposium, the first salvo exploded overhead in a simultaneous canopy of shrapnel. Men who would have dived at the first dull impact now learned the news from the sound of airburst. A young FDC lieutenant at a divisional battalion kept a notebook that winter. His marginalia show the new arithmetic in human terms. Impact VT over road. Density, Charchitorthrix at 525 meters from centerline. Time fuse errors compounded by met. VT cures met slop if the gunnery is honest. TOT with VT. FO reports no movement after first minute more often. He is not doing inflammatory math. He is doing an accountant's math for violence. His battalion learned to treat assembly areas as events rather than objects. You do not shell the woodline. You erase movement in a grid at 0921. Forward observers rewrote their calls to exploit the new height. The best FOs began to talk in canopies. Burst above second row of trunks, over road crown, past bend, airburst. Fire for effect became less of a staircase and more of a trap door. In villages where stone walls had turned impact bursts into photogenic dust and not much else, VT multiplied window laceration and backyard lethality. House-to-house attackers learned to pause for artillery scalpel before committing to the next alley. The infantry prayer, "Please let the artillery be on our side today," remained pious, but the amen sounded more like confidence. The geometry had counters and caveats. When German units hugged close to American lines to get under the guns, proximity demanded even more care with safety boxes. VT does not care who you are, it cares how far you are. FOs who loved dramatic danger close before December watched shards of pine rain down on their own helmets and relearned why doctrine draws fences. The good ones adjusted their language and their lacing, figurative in those days, precise all the same. Lift 50, still airburst. We are too close to this chapel. The best artillery is a clinician, not a butcher. VT made clinicians out of crews who intended to be. In the nights that followed the first ground authorizations, the FDCs practiced in the dark. They ran simulated missions with a watch and a pencil, played taut in 3 grids on blacked-out boards, and drilled runners to move the right fuses to the right guns without drama. Proximity did not reduce workload. It concentrated effect. Battery commanders who had once saved the good stuff for glamour targets began to treat VT for the ordinary as doctrine. Roads, likely assembly bends, treeline kinks, reverse slopes, all became ordinary. In the Bulge, that was a synonym for vital. Snow is a liar. It displays violence perfectly to the eye, black dirt fountains, heroic geysers, and absorbs it perfectly in reality. An impact-fused shell that buries itself into snow and frozen earth couples most of its energy into the ground. Shrapnel sprays upward through a column of air where men are not. The powder's quick chemistry and the steel's furious birth end in a clean white puff and a survivable afternoon for any soldier who had the sense to drop flat. VT rewrote the lie. By bursting aloft, the shell flung its fragments laterally into the slice of space where humans exist. Between boot and helmet, above their hasty scrapes, across road ditches where men cowered by habit. Timbered terrain had been a German ally, a place where impact shells kissed trunks and died, where time fuses punished the haste of a cold FO. Proximity loved trees the way lightning loves church steeples. Burst just under the canopy, and the ricochet geometry goes mad in your favor. Fragments that might have bled out in soft loam now multiplied among wood, bark, and seam. The forest, a friend to the patient, became a hall of knives to anyone caught mustering under it. After-action interviews recorded phrases like, "Air became hot," and snowflakes turned black. That is how memory thinks about fragment density maps. Engineers had done the maps. They knew fragment size distributions for standard shells, tracked how jacket steel tore into menacing confetti, and plotted lethal radii as functions of height and ground type. In open ground with VT bursts around 20 feet, a 105 mm HE shell could produce a lethal fragment density out to tens of meters that impact could not touch without a perfect ricochet. In woods, the presence of obstacles thickened the storm at mid-range. No FO needed the numbers to believe the outcome. He needed only to listen after the first volley. The silence after VT was a quieter thing than the silence after impact. Bridges and road cuts turned into laboratories. German columns that once counted on hugging banks and stone walls to trick blast learned that metal hung in air did not respect cover that had no roof. A column waiting to lunge at a frozen bridge shivered under the first American volley, and then stopped shivering. American engineers laying charges felt for once that the world above them was on their side. Commanders began to pair VT prep with demo team moves, accusing the air of treason against anyone planning to mass. The enemy adapted with the cleverness that had given American soldiers so many bad days in 1944. German units spread out more when time and terrain allowed. They staged assemblies deeper in ravines. They asked for more smoke. Their artillery tried to answer the dance with counter-battery, and their mortarmen made American open tops skittish. None of it erased the physics. VT rewarded a battery that could compute honestly, and a crew that could lay true. Spread or not, mass or not, men must cross spaces, and in those spaces the air had been rewired against them. Casualty reports moved from adjectives to ratios. Battalion surgeons noticed pattern changes, fewer dirt punctures in legs, more fragment wounds high on the body, not more men hit by miracles, but more men hit by math. Platoon leaders began to speak about the first-minute problem, how a formation that expected to prance into cover found itself sprawled, command severed, will bleeding into the snow. That minute widened gaps in attack schedules, delayed counterthrusts across critical bridges, and forced German officers, many brave, some brilliant, to improvise under a sky that punished improvisation. Proximity was not a panacea. In close country, shells still had to be walked in carefully. In villages, walls still caught fragments that would have loved flesh. VT did not give American artillery permission to be lazy. It gave it an opportunity to be decisive. The war in the Ardennes was still decided by men climbing into basements, clearing kitchens, throwing grenades upstairs, and trading shots in streets whose names no one will ever learn. But now, the spaces between those rooms belonged to a fuse that cared only about distance and treated trees as friends of the man who set the quadrant correctly. The order's true meaning arrived on roads. Every German counterattack needed roads, frozen tracks that ran through cut banks and farm bends, the arteries along which armor rumbled and infantry jogged. American artillery had always targeted those places. With VT, the targeting acquired a mean precision. When regimental S3s penciled, "Enemy force will likely assemble here," they no longer shrugged at the trees. They imagined a canopy punctured by steel orchids of airburst. The phrase, "We'll put a barrage across the road," became, "We'll lay a stitched ceiling." Bridges were worse. For the enemy, better for the math. Engineers on both sides understand bridges with an intimacy that verges on romance. They also understand that bridges compress battle into humiliating simplicity. You are either on, off, or dead. With proximity, American artillery could make on and off into overlapping definitions of despair. A battery set a limited TOT, laid VT bursts 20 feet above the deck, and then watched through FO glasses as men and vehicles confronted an air they could not negotiate with. Explosions on the deck are theater. Explosions over your head are eviction notices. Demolition teams finally got breathing room to fuse charges, and bridge guards could fight with rifles instead of prayers. An infamous bend outside a small Ardennes village, its name matters to a handful of veterans, and no textbook, illustrated the new doctrine. German grenadiers had twice used the bend as an assembly alcove, masked from direct fire by bank and barn. On the third day, an American FO hiked into a wood line on hands and knees, found a view slit across the bend, and called for a battery with VT. Grid confirmed. 2 rounds adjust. The first volley hung hot lead above surprised helmets. The correction was minimal. Fire for effect. What had been a bend became a place where snow turned black, then red, then still. The counterattack scheduled for 12 never announced itself. Records say enemy activity diminished. The FO wrote, "No movement after first minute." A platoon of engineers rolled out their wire in daylight for the first time that week. The destruction of assembly areas had strategic weight beyond the body count. Counterattacks rely on clocks as much as bravery. In December's short days, a counterattack delayed is often a counterattack denied. VT extended delays from minutes to never. German officers, educated in mission command, could still think around trouble, but thinking around airburst in a forest is a different sport. You must find a new assembly, sketch a new approach, and coordinate units whose radios are already crackling with other bad news. Meanwhile, American divisions learned to sleep with boots on and breathe between barrages. Bridgeheads the Germans needed to expand now pulsed with artillery that punished the act of expanding. If you tried to fan out on the far bank, you entered a census of airbursts. If you clustered to push hard at a point, you invited a ringing ceiling. Assault guns creeping forward under low trees no longer enjoyed impact, fuses hissing into trunks and dying like fireworks. They flinched under airburst that peppered crews, smashed periscopes, and made drivers prefer reverse. Bridge defenders, once fated to be extras in other people's dramas, acquired starring roles. A call for fire, an airburst curtain, and a sudden quiet that agreed with the doctrine. All of it depended on moving VT loads where they mattered. Staffs learned art. They pushed proximity crates to sectors where German maps were ambitious. They told certain battalions, quietly, "Save for bridges, save for assembly woods, save for that road with a name your kids won't believe." The rest of the guns kept the old tricks and did good work with them. In the Bulge, not every battery had VT every day. Not every mission deserved VT. The genius was not that commanders used proximity everywhere. It was that they used it exactly where the German plan needed the world to behave, like 1917. The world refused. No fuse kills by itself. The supply chain that fed VT into rifles of steel began far from the tree line. Ordnance depots, bulked with winter's breath, sorted crates by lot and temperament. Drivers learned that certain boxes rode inside, away from cold that could bully batteries. Liaison officers became evangelists with spreadsheets. Send 2 crates to the 155s near the hour, 4 to the 105s covering the bend, and 1 to the battalion guarding the bridge at X. The rest wait here under tarps. It sounds like bureaucracy. It is war. On the gun lines, drill got fussier and therefore faster. The paradox, fewer corners cut equals more speed in the hour that matters, mattered. Powder temperature cards were not suggestions. Gunners made a ritual of cracking a charge bag and feeling the powder as if it were an animal. Cold as lies, at a click. Tube wear boards got a daily rub with a gloved thumb. Busted 1,000 equivalent full charges. Quadrant gets the love. Bore sights were not for schools anymore. They were for now. The tighter the solution, the truer the fuse. Battery commanders inherited a new problem, rationing brilliance. VT rounds were not infinite. The temptation to spend them on every target was strong. Good officers learned to translate desire into doctrine. Impact for harassing fire. Time fuse where met is friendly, and we have time to cut. VT for assemblies, roads, bridge decks, treeline kinks. Save 1 box for the night you'll need to erase a rumor. Men who had watched the front collapse under tanks became masters of patience, which is a cousin of courage that rarely gets medals. Crew chiefs watched their men for cold stupidity, the special kind of error a human makes when his fingers are stones and his skin feels like glass. Proximity demanded ordinary safety multiplied. Nose caps on until the minute of loading. Don't rattle, don't jolt, don't help a fuse that helps itself. Accidents were rare because fear is a teacher, and because crews had discovered in a day what the fuse did for the men they cared about. If anxiety threatened to slow hands, the first hot airburst cured it. We will not have anyone dying because you were in a hurry and felt brave. The sergeant's voice was not a suggestion either. FDCs, which lived on the edge between arithmetic and panic, adopted a new modesty. They logged heights, weather, and errors with an accountant's honesty because the fuse punished lies with dead friends. They also learned when to stop talking. In the best batteries, someone always had the job of silence, one human whose job was to listen for the call to repeat and say repeat without flourish. The fuse had eliminated a step. The battery owed it clarity in return. Public relations never entered the conversation. There were no cameras to photograph an idea. An impact shell makes a photogenic geyser. A proximity shell paints the air. The only photography was in bodies and in plans that never launched. That was enough. Crews lit cigarettes with trembling fingers, swore the way men swear to push tears back down their throats, and wrote the next grid on the slate. Enemy accounts are sober reading. German officers in the Ardennes were not amateurs. They were veterans of long, complicated years. Many were brave and competent. What they were not prepared for was an air that had turned against assembly. In interviews after the war, several used the same language without coordination. The shells had Augen, eyes. Of course, the fuses had no eyes. They had ears. But to a man caught in a tree line that had promised shelter for 3 winters, the metaphors were permitted. German artillery knew airburst and used it when it could. Their time fuses, cut conscientiously, could do damage that men remembered. The difference in December was not that only one side could be clever. It was that one side could be clever faster and more often, through snow and across woods, in the exact minute when mass makes or breaks a plan. German countermeasures, spread the men, rush the road, smoke the bend, show up in American after-action reports as footnotes. The smoke sometimes worked, the spreading sometimes worked. But the clock kept failing them. A German captain tasked to push a company across a small bridge learned the nature of failure that month. He had counted on impact shells hammering the approaches, a familiar drum you can sprint between. Instead, the first volley arrived in the air. He watched half a squad drop, not to ground, but to pieces. He pulled the men back under a low wall and called for smoke. The smoke lifted into an air also filled with shards. He tried again later with a different approach and found a tow-tee waiting, a ceiling that flickered across the deck like a murderous aurora. His diary entry is dry. Artillery fire caused delays. Losses, attempt shifted to night. Night did not help. Road ice kept the clock mean. Somewhere, an American FDC noted, attempts ceased. German armor understood that a tree is a friend. It also learned that periscopes made of glass and men made of hope do not enjoy airburst that pecks at both. Crews new to the front had been taught to ignore frivolous artillery if the shells hit dirt. They learned to respect air that broke on their helmets. Assault guns that once dared to lead learned to wait for infantry that never arrived because the assembly area had gone missing. When your method relies on rhythm, a fuse that ruins a measure is worse than a pitched battle you lose honestly. It is a theft of time. Some German artillery units experimented with their own proximity technologies in the late war. Too few, too late, in too many places where doctrine had to be invented on Tuesday for Wednesday morning. The American system had years and factories behind it, test ranges and rewrites, conferences where colonels argued about gates and thresholds with scientists who smelled like solar. In December's woods, it looked like a simple thing that made roads dangerous. The simplicity was purchased in laboratories. The danger was rented by FDCs who did not need to understand how a thyratron feels about cold to know how to temper a battery's impatience. The phrase 50 times deadlier is an exaggeration you sometimes see in letters and oral histories. The engineering ratios are smaller and more delicious if you love graphs. But for a man who expected to cross a road under a familiar drizzle of dirt puffs and instead watched friends collapse under a necklace of overhead bursts, 50 times feels conservative. War is fought in feelings as much as in charts. VT's genius was to make the chart and the feeling point in the same direction. If you must quantify the leap, do it like a staff officer with conscience. Start with fragment density at human height. An impact-fused 105 mm shell in frozen ground, detonating at or just below surface, delivers a lethal fragment density at chest height that decays quickly with distance, especially in soft snow. A proximity-fused burst at 20-30 feet produces a lateral storm. Lethal fragment density at 10-30 meters is multiple times higher than impact, and the curve decays more politely beyond that. Under timber, the multiplication factor is messy but meaner. Ricochet proliferation adds a frosting of danger even where line of sight suggests mercy. Then consider timing. A tow-tee with impact shells alerts targets with the first thumps. Soldiers who see geysers have a second or two to flatten or tumble into ditches. A tow-tee with VT shells alerts with the first screams of shrapnel already in their air. The window for reaction narrows, and the probability of being 4 inches too slow increases. Reaction time curves, which look generous in doctrine, look rude under proximity. A staff officer's pencil writes, suppression probability, neutralization window. He does not mean loud words. He means the enemy moves less and later. Add in weather. Time fuses are jealous of met. Proximity fuses are egalitarian, indifferent to a few variables that used to punish a tired FO. When temperature sag steals powder energy and pushes your time fuse airburst lower than planned, proximity reads the distance and corrects in flight. When wind spoils your range guess by 50 yards, proximity surrenders to nobody. It detonates as distance collapses on the right number. This is not magic. It is simply a different place in the loop where you choose to be precise. Finally, turn to operational effect. Lethality is not only bodies, it is plans that never stand up. A road you turn into a weekly funeral teaches the enemy to pick another road. A bridge you paint with invisible teeth teaches an engineer to ask for a miracle that isn't coming. A forest that used to be an ally and now behaves like a traitor teaches a battalion commander to write different orders, slower, wider, more careful, under a calendar that hates him. By the time you tally men and minutes, 50 times is poor math but good poetry. The ledger balances without exaggeration. Fewer of ours die taking the same ground, and more of theirs fail to take ground that looked easy on the map. That is what a new fuse is supposed to buy. American doctrine had always worshipped at the altar of massed fires. Proximity offered a new hymn, not a different church. Corps artillery learned to push VT where counters mattered, bridges, bends, assembly woods, and leave impact and time to the daily devotions of harassment and interdiction. Division commanders wrote proximity into bridge defense, SOP. On alarm, VT above deck, 1 minute, lift 200, repeat. Infantry manuals did not change. The men carrying rifles changed their habits. Pause before the next hedgerow for the new ceiling to work. Call for a tree cut with VT before you try to smoke out a machine gun in the next stand. Engineers stopped assuming that every tree line assembly would survive prep and began to plan to cross open spaces under an American-made sky. On the German side, counter-assumptions matured fast. They learned to dig deeper near roads. They pushed point men into ravines. They requested smoke with a fervor that made American gunners respect a good mortar crew. They tried night. Night worked sometimes. Often the ice stole what the air no longer gave. When German armor hugged our lines, our gunners returned to old delicacies. Delay fuses to reach under, precise time fuse when the canopy was too thick for VT to matter. Proximity never replaced judgment. It rewarded it. Commanders in the Bulge were not running a lab. They were running a triage ward with maps. The brilliance of the week after the order was not the technology. It was the staff work that moved it into the right hands. That is the part of the story that looks dull and is not. A major who pushes 3 crates toward the right battery and writes "hold" on 2 others, while a captain begs for them, is a kind of killer, too. His weapon is forecast and discipline. He wins the bend none of us will ever visit by starving a sector that can live on impact one more day. In the ledger of the Ardennes, such decisions shine if you tilt the page to the light. By New Year's, the shock had become method. VT was still guarded. Boxes still traveled under tarps. Fuses still got warmed inside coats on the worst mornings. But the sentence that had arrived quiet, VT authorized for ground, now read like it had been engraved in the way everyone spoke. We'll VT the road. VT for the first minute, then impact to keep their heads down. VT the bridge, then smoke the far bank. A fuse had acquired verbs. That is how you know doctrine is not an essay anymore. It is a habit. After the Bulge, the proximity fuse did not go back into a cabinet. It went forward, the way good ideas do after they prove that they are not ideas anymore. In the Ruhr, in the push to the rivers, in forests that looked like cousins of Ardennes groves, American gunners carried the lesson. Electronics, small, rude, robust, could decide as much as steel. The myth of German inevitability in the winter woods had cracked. Not because Germans had less courage on Thursday than on Tuesday, but because a fuse had let American artillery talk to distance in a new language. If you want to honor the week the order came through, do not picture miracles. Picture ordinary men doing old jobs with a new tool and refusing to be impressed by it. A gunner who sets VT with the same bored care he uses to lay a tube straight. An FO who calls for airburst over the road crown, as if he were ordering coffee. An FDC clerk whose pencil moves without flourish across charge 3, VT, HE, toe T, because the pencil knows more glory than any adjective. A driver who shuffles crates in a truck's belly so that a battery he has never seen can put a ceiling over a bridge he will never cross. Electronics, not just steel, decided fields in that winter. Not alone, never alone, but decisively. And in their wake came the logic that will define every war after. If you can sense the world in the moment before the moment matters, you can force the moment to break your way. The proximity fuse was a small, tin-capped promise that this was true. In the Bulge, when the world said it was too late, the promise arrived on a truck, was opened with cold hands, and made a tree line honest for the first time in a war that had rarely been. That is why the week feels bigger than a paragraph in a history. A quiet order turned shells into listeners, trees into allies, roads into traps, and minutes into verdicts. It took a weapon every army has had since gunpowder, the idea that you can throw metal farther than you can touch, and taught it to touch air instead of earth. German veterans swore the shells had eyes. Better to say they had ears, and that we finally listened with them. The result was not a miracle. It was better. It was repeatable. And in a war that devoured miracles and punished hope, repeatable was the closest thing to mercy any soldier could afford.